Beneath the pale dawn sky of Wyoming, the snow falls slow and silent over the forgotten town of Maple Hollow. Here, a weary war veteran named Robert Carter stands beside his old pickup, frost gathering on his beard. His wife Evelyn adjusts the sign outside the church hall, Healing Hands Project, free first aid for all. Behind them, their son Micah and their loyal German shepherd, Buddy, chase snowflakes like they're chasing a second chance at life. This isn't a story about heroes. It's about two people trying to turn their scars into shelter, not just for themselves, but for everyone who's lost faith. Robert rebuilds a fallen soldier's home. Evelyn teaches strangers how to save lives. And little by little, a silent town begins to breathe again. But peace is fragile. One night, fire returns, devouring the barn, testing the courage that war could never take. And through smoke, fear, and prayer, Robert learns that some miracles don't come from heaven above. They come from each other. Because sometimes, God's light doesn't break through the clouds. It flickers in a child's laughter, a wife's steady hand, and the loyal heartbeat of a dog standing guard in the dark. As the town gathers to sing under falling snow, hope rises once more, not loud, but alive. And the Carters know their road isn't ending here. It's only turning toward the next sunrise. Before they leave Maple Hollow behind, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And please, like and subscribe. If you believe that, every scar can become a story. Every act of kindness can be a miracle. And that love, even after war, can still find its way home. The morning came on like a hush of feathers. The sky a pale pewter bowl. The air so cold it made sound itself slow down. Snow fell in sifted powder, soft as sifted flour, settling in the seams of Maple Hollow, where winter had learned every address. A two-lane road cut through the bare cottonwoods, and down it rolled a sun-faded blue pickup with a crooked passenger mirror that had seen more states than a traveling preacher. Robert Carter kept his hands at 10 and 2, the way the Army once taught him, even for steering Humvees and convoys, the way he still preferred, because rituals made doubt behave. He was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, a face of weathered lines earned under harsher suns. A dark stubble framed his jaw, like charcoal smudged by a careful hand. A small nick scar crossed his left eyebrow, pale as chalk in winter light. In the cab's glow, his eyes, steel gray, not cold so much as watchful, counted distance, exits, the angle of ditches, and the possibility of deer. He drove as if responsibility were not a thing you carried, but a thing you could keep alive by noticing. Beside him, Evelyn cradled a paper cup of coffee gone lukewarm, fingers slender and sure, even when tired. She had the kind of beauty that refused theater. Brown hair pulled into a practical knot under a knitted cap, skin dusted with the faint winter pink of a woman who'd chosen to be outdoors when others hid. Dark eyes that could be stern the way mercy sometimes was. Once in a tent hospital, those eyes had seen too much blood. Today they searched for something gentler, a sign on a church, an open hall, a room where healing didn't smell like antiseptic. In the back seat, their 8-year-old son Micah half dozed, a sleeping cap tilted above sandy brown hair that always seemed a week overdue for trimming. A constellation of freckles wandered his cheekbones. Micah's breath fogged the window glass, where he'd drawn a crooked heart around a stick figure, man, woman, child, and a 4-eared dog. The dog in question, Buddy, a 4-year-old German shepherd, occupied the bench seat like a second guardian angel. Black and tan coat, clean as a parade unit, Ears pricked, amber eyes scanning fence lines, and culverts with the quiet diligence of someone who never truly came off duty. Buddy's chest broadened with each controlled breath. A faint scar tracked the fur above his right shoulder, a memento from a fence he'd cleared for a boy not old enough to vote. "Almost there," Robert said, his voice a low gravel warmth that could comfort or command. The windshield wipers whispered their tired metronome. Maple Hollow, population. He glanced at a sign thinned by years. Apparently shy. "It looks tucked in," Evelyn murmured, like it forgot how to come back out. She watched the storefronts, brick and clapboard in faded paints, sage, buttercream, barn red. She noticed how the lettering on windows leaned, how an awning drooped, how a wreath left since last Christmas now held a snowbird's nest. "I'll need a room with space for a table and a mat," she added, mind already dismantling worry into plans. "If I can find a church hall, or even a wide hallway, we can start with basic first aid. There are never too many hands that know how to stop a bleed." Robert nodded. "And I'll see about a job that pays in supplies, or in stories." One corner of his mouth lifted. Humor with him often arrived on foot, unannounced, modest, carrying its own chair. They took a room in a faded motor court behind the town's gas station, the kind with exterior doors and a Coke machine that swallowed dollar bills and offered philosophical silence in return. The proprietor, Berta Klein, a woman in her late 50s with fluffy gray hair and the sharp, kindly stare of a retired librarian, handed them a brass key on a blue fob. "Furnace rattles like an old man telling stories," she warned, "but it keeps you warm if you treat it like it's doing you a favor." Her sweater wore a stitched cardinal near the left shoulder. "You traveling through or traveling for?" "For," Evelyn said, because that was truer than any direction. For something. Berta studied Buddy with professional suspicion that broke into fondness in under 3 seconds. "No shedding on the bedspreads," she said to the dog, then to Micah. "And that goes for you too." Micah grinned, revealing the exact gap where a front tooth was negotiating its exit. Buddy sat, as if to reassure the proprietor he was the kind of dog who knew the difference between a command and a courtesy. That first evening, Maple Hollow introduced itself cautiously. A baker's sign blinked out at dusk and stayed out. A few men at the diner kept their conversation inside their coffee cups. Snow hushed the alleys and made the street lamps look patient. From their room's window, Robert watched a plow drift through town like a slow ship in heavy seas. He watched the way people moved, short steps, shoulders tight, eyes down. He'd seen that gait before in cities the war had left behind, the way a community braced itself against disappointment. "Do you see it?" Evelyn asked softly, though he already had. He turned from the sill. Half his face held lamplight. The other half kept the day. "They look like folks who put their hearts out on the porch, and somebody stole the porch." Evelyn's smile was small and brave. "Then let's build them one. A porch, a platform, whatever we can." At first light, the town's church, St. Bartholomew's, opened to them like a cautious hand. Pastor Glenn Whitaker, mid-60s, a narrow man with a tidy gray beard and the kind of linen shirt that suggested he ironed his own collars out of respect for rituals, listened as Evelyn made her ask. Glenn's hazel eyes held the quick brightness of a person who'd spent years convincing winter to let spring have a turn. "You're a nurse?" Repeated. "Was," she answered, and her throat tightened on that small word. "Am. Some parts don't wear off." Glenn led her into a fellowship hall with scuffed floors and a stage crowned by a piano, whose lower A had long since given up dignity. If you need it, it's yours, he said simply. But folks are slow to come out these days. He rubbed his knuckles, an old arthritic habit. We've had layoffs, a mill shuttered. A fire last winter took the Hart's grocery. Hard to convince a town to believe in Band-Aids when the wounds feel bigger. Wounds are wounds, Evelyn said. You stop the bleeding you can see. You listen to the bleeding you can't. Glenn's mouth tipped with gratitude. You talk like my late wife, he said, voice going tender. She believed in small salvations. You can start this afternoon if you like. So they staked their claim, not with hammers first, but with tape and triangular bandages. Evelyn chalked a schedule on a portable board. Free first aid class, 2 p.m. She laid out gauze, antiseptic, an orange practice tourniquet that slithered like a rubber snake and made Micah grin. She set a tea urn and a plate of oatmeal cookies, as if medicine could be sweetened, and maybe it could. At 2, 2 people came. A grandmother named Doris Talley, round-cheeked, 60-something, with mittens on a string and a laugh that surprised itself, wanted to learn how to fall without breaking a hip. A teen named Asher Pike, tall and bony, with a shock of black hair that refused to obey laws or combs, came because he said he liked gross stuff, and then blushed a scarlet that betrayed other reasons, like the way he lingered over how to wrap an ankle sprain as if he had someone in mind. Evelyn taught with a steadiness that made simple things feel sacred. Confidence is a skill, she told them, demonstrating how to apply pressure, how to talk to a frightened stranger as if you already believed in both of you. She put Doris on a mat and showed her how to fold into a fall like a dancer of gravity. She handed Asher a rolled towel and turned it into a splint, and the boy's hands, clumsy at first, learned precisely where gentle and firm became the same word. Robert, having left them mid-class with a squeeze to Evelyn's shoulder, followed an address scratched on an index card Berta had slid across the counter. He won't ask, Berta had said, eyes soft and shrewd, so you'll have to pretend you didn't hear him not asking. The house sat at the town's edge, where the cottonwoods thinned and the wind stopped making polite conversation. The porch listed like a tired ship, shingles missing like teeth in a grin that had fought too many winters. A blue tarp flapped, arguing with its staples. A hand-painted sign crooked on the post read, Mason, in letters that had been written by a man who still cared about straight lines, even when his hands shook. Elias Lee Mason opened the door to a crack and considered the stranger and the Mason was early 70s, rangy despite a shrunken calf under stiff denim. His right pant leg ended in a scuffed wood and metal prosthesis that had seen more American counties than he liked. His face was plainsman angular, cheekbones high, jaw narrow, lips sun-cracked. A sparse silver beard traced his jaw like winter weeds, and his eyes, a washed blue, had the distant look of land promised and then taken back. A shallow crescent scar, tucked near his left ear, disappeared under hair that needed a barber who charged by the story, not the inch. I didn't call for help, he said. His voice was smoke-scraped, as if he'd spent years talking to stoves, and they'd taught him their accent. Good, Robert said. I'm not here to answer the phone. He lifted the toolbox in his right hand. I came because your porch is trying to become a sled. A flick of humor passed over Mason's features, and just as swiftly defaulted to suspicion. You a carpenter or a savior? Just a man who's found out that wood listens better than people if you swing a hammer right, Robert said. Name's Carter. That's Buddy. He'll mind his manners unless your porch insults his mother. Dog's too pretty, Mason grumbled. And Buddy, as if in honor of that comment, sneezed. The sound startled Mason into a cough that became a laugh, and then he stood back to let them in. Inside smelled like damp books and pine cleaner. The living room was neat in the fussy way of a person holding chaos off with coasters and folded blankets. Framed photographs stood in a uniform parade on the mantel. A much younger Mason in fatigues, a smiling woman with a kerchief holding a pie, a boy with Mason's cheekbones and a stubborn tilt to his mouth standing in front of a bass boat. That same boy in dress blues then. Nothing for a long stretch of mantle. Then Mason in a suit that didn't fit at a graveside in gray weather. There was a polite blank where a whole life should have been hung. Mason watched Robert notice. "You served," he said, making it a statement because he recognized the way Robert's gaze skated past the photographs, like a man who'd learned not to stare into mirrors after midnight. "Army," Robert said. "You?" "Marine, Vietnam. They gave me back in installments." He tapped the prosthesis with the edge of a folded newspaper. Humor as thistle. Prickly, hardy, oddly beautiful in bloom. "If you're here to talk about God, talk to the pastor. If you're here to talk about the government, take a number. If you're here to work," he gestured at the door, "I can hold a board." They worked in a companionable quiet that sounded, to anyone listening, like two men still choosing the right words. Snow hissed off the tarp. The rhythm of the hammer stitched afternoon together. Knock, set, drive, pry. Robert's gloves darkened with melt. The fine ache in his forearms took up, residence beside an older ache that never left, since the day something had gone wrong far from home, and a radio had said words that broke more than they warned. Mason held boards and curses with equal steadiness. Now and then he told a small thing, the way men like him did. A two-line story that pretended it wasn't a poem. "My boy," he'd start, and then look at the tree line, and then say instead, "You want nails or screws?" "Whatever makes it stay," Robert said. At dusk, the porch stood less like a shipwreck and more like a structure. Robert stowed the hammer, back twinging with the grateful pain that came from doing something uncomplicated and right. Mason leaned against the railing they'd saved. "I still don't need help," he said, which in his language meant, "I am grateful and afraid of owing anyone." Robert dusted his gloves. "Then consider this a selfish act," he said. "I needed to fix something today that wasn't inside my head." Mason's gaze softened. "Your wife know you talk like a man auditioning for a book of Psalms." "She encourages it," Robert said. "Says it embarrasses fewer neighbors than swearing." They shared the kind of smile reserved for people who'd both learned that laughter could be a bridge that didn't collapse under weight. When Robert returned to town, evening dangled its string of streetlights. In the church hall, Evelyn wrote a list of names that had doubled from 2 to 4. Doris had brought a sister with a brace and a laugh louder than her own. Asher returned, hair not obeying even gravity now, bringing a friend. Milo Vance, soft-spoken, heavy-set, with hands big enough to hold fear gently. Micah sprawled on a blanket with crayons, drawing Buddy as a superhero with a cape and a badge. Buddy lay with his chin on Micah's knee, tail thumping to an internal waltz. Evelyn glanced up as Robert leaned in the doorway, snow beating on his shoulders. There was always a piece of battlefield in him when he came in from the cold. Something about thresholds did that to soldiers, but it retreated in the warmth of her expression. "How was your day?" she asked. "Met a man who argues like a porch, and a porch that argues like a man," Robert said. "We negotiated. No injuries." Evelyn's eyes smiled, though she remembered to keep her mouth stern for the class. "And we had repetitions and gloved practice," she said. "Asher is a natural. He splinted Milo's wrist with a rolled magazine, like he'd been waiting all his life for an excuse to be careful." They ate soup from a diner the pastor swore by, and then swore at, when the salt ran away with itself. Micah fell asleep between slurps, and Buddy, with the delicacy of a nurse, used his nose to keep Micah's blanket from escaping his shoulders. Home is not a place, Robert thought, so much as a ritual of noticing. The storm arrived after midnight, not the theatrical kind with thunder speeches, but the relentless kind that sent a tireless wind down every chimney and propped its shoulder against every door. By 2 a.m., snow fell in ropes, not flakes. By 3, the gusts found a language to curse in. Robert lay awake a while, hearing the old motor court heating system talk like a veteran who had opinions. At 3:40, the phone on the bedside table, a landline, because some towns refused to give up the last number that could still find them, rang its own emergency. Robert answered in one syllable. Years teach you to waste no words when they matter. On the line, Berta's voice braided with wind. "Mason's place," she said. "Gus, that's the plow. Saw a sag in his roof like a hammock for worries." "I'm going," Robert said, already standing. He dressed in layers, the choreography of trust between him and cold weather, learned in the mountains after a different war. Thermal, flannel, jacket, scarf, gloves. He touched Evelyn's shoulder. She woke instantly. A nurse's gift. He told her with his eyes first, then with a whisper. She sat up, reached for her boots. "Stay with Micah," he said gently. It wasn't an order. It was a prayer. Buddy stood at the door already, tail held still, ears not just up, but listening. Some nights dogs seemed to grow taller with purpose. Robert clipped the lead mostly for show. "Let's work, partner," he said. Outside, the storm was a white animal with too many teeth. The truck shuddered, but advanced. Snow rose around the wheel wells like the tide. The good thing about towns that forget hope is that they never forget how to tie chains. The bad thing is that sometimes they do forget why. Robert did not. He drove the way he had in convoys in dust, a line of sight on things that weren't even visible. Mason's house appeared as a darker dark against the storm. Roofline slumped, porch stubborn. A light burned in a front room, a soft rectangle of intention. Robert killed the engine and stepped into the kind of cold that made names brittle. "Buddy," he said, and the dog needed no more. The front door was jammed by snowdrift. The side door had iced its hinges into stone. Robert cut around to the rear, boots punching holes in the drifts. Buddy bounded and broke and bounded, chest heaving, fur catching a rhyme that made him look older. Behind the house, Robert found the kitchen window struggling half open over a sink of dishes that gleamed like winter moons. "Here," he said, and Buddy navigated the packed snow with the grace of a creature born to solve problems. Inside, the house had that particular tightness, heat trying to hold, cold insisting. "Lee!" Robert called. From the hall. "Back bedroom!" A cough, muffled. A crack like a complaint from timber. Robert moved fast. He found Mason in bed, leg stump propped awkwardly, a wool cap on his head, like a stubborn decision. The ceiling above had bowed into a shallow V. Chunks of plaster lay on the rug like broken plates. "You should see the other guy," Mason said, Because even men most at risk understand the therapy of a joke set at the right volume. "Up we go," Robert said. He and Buddy executed a practice dance, dog forward to test space, man lifting, shifting, supporting. Mason hissed when the prosthesis caught. "Head down, breathe," Robert said, and Mason followed orders from a voice that knew how to give them without stealing dignity. They went slow through a narrow hall that had been built for smaller winters. A groan arced through the house, deep and old. At the far end, the kitchen door refused them. "Window," Robert said. Buddy leapt onto the sink like a sudden saint and looked back. "Here." Robert opened the sash with his shoulder, tasted iron and dust. He handed Buddy the wool throw by its corner. "On him," he told the dog, and Buddy draped the blanket over Mason's shoulders with tug-and-nose genius that would have made a scoutmaster cry. Robert boosted Mason through the window to the drift. Buddy followed, and then turned back, barked once. "Hurry." Robert had just swung one leg over the sill when the ceiling in the back room surrendered with a rafter-splitting growl. He dropped into snow and rolled, shielding his head. The house exhaled an old grief. Snow swallowed them to the knees, then to the mid-thigh. Buddy climbed a drift and made himself a small lighthouse, alert, tail a metronome of encouragement until the rhythm matched Robert's breathing again. By dawn, they had Mason in the truck's cab, the heater insisting on heroism. Mason coughed and then, because the body must sometimes reset itself with gratitude, fell asleep. Robert sat with his hands on the wheel, not yet moving, letting his pulse come down. Buddy placed his head on Mason's lap with the officious delicacy of a good nurse who knows that warmth is a kind of prescription. When they rolled back into town, they were three figures carved in frost, and Maple Hollow, which had already begun to gather for its day of effects and rumors, saw them and chose applause. It began with Doris, who clapped mittened hands, and then with Asher, who whooped like the boy he still was. And then the whole uncertain street found itself with something easy to do. Make noise with hands to say "well done" when words were still shy. Pastor Glenn shuffled out to touch Mason's shoulder. "We'll find you room at the rectory," he said. Mason pretended to hate everything about this suggestion, then failed convincingly. Evelyn arrived at a run, hair disobedient, eyes bright. Relief, which is grief's happier cousin, veined her face. She checked Mason's pupils, his lungs, the violation on his prosthesis strap. She handed him warm tea the way battlefield nurses learn to hand men back to themselves. Robert watched her work and felt something in him, coiled ever since, ease like a muscle that had finally been given a stretch that wasn't pain. The snow thinned to a gentler fall. The morning brightened as if applause itself could move weather. People who had not spoken in months brought blankets, casseroles, the names of carpenters and cousins. Little girls put Buddy in a wreath of paper hearts like he was king of practical bravery. Buddy wore it with mortified dignity and the private pride of someone who had never needed a crown to know who he was. It would have been a perfect ending to the day. Except Robert, when he returned to Mason's house to fetch photographs, found something the storm had not made. In the back bedroom, under the collapsed ceiling, a roof beam's edge showed a clean, hard line. Not fracture, but cut. Not the random torn tooth of heavy snow, but the straight mouth of a saw. Near the window, where drift had formed a white pillow, the snow bore the shape of a boot tread that did not belong to him. The pattern was modern, not old rancher scuffs. The size, larger than his own. The direction, wrong. inside to out. On the windowsill, buried in slush, a small thing gleamed. A bright red plastic fuel cap from a cheap gas can, the kind bought at a general store when you didn't want to leave a receipt memorable enough for questions. He stood very still, the house settling around him like a slow animal, listening to the quiet. He felt the old habits take their seats inside him, the squad leader, the investigator of what had gone wrong, the man who knew that sometimes winter was a cover for people who preferred problems to look like weather. He slid the cap into his pocket the way you slip a prayer into a coat, then looked again at the cut beam, and knew. Someone had given the storm a head start. Behind him, Buddy's nails clicked on the kitchen tile. The dog came and sat at Robert's left thigh, pressing close the way he did when the air changed. Robert's hand found the rough, warm and alive. Outside, Maple Hollow cheered the morning, laughed into paper cups of diner coffee, and told the first hopeful story it had told. In years, inside, a new story began. Not about snow, not about luck, but about a hand with a saw, and a reason. Robert exhaled. "Looks like we're staying," he murmured. Buddy's ears lifted. Ready. And the town, which had only just now remembered how to believe in small salvations, did not yet know. It also needed to remember how to stand together against those who preferred arson. To resolution, the thaw came reluctantly, like an old man rising from prayer. The snow retreated from the curbs, revealing the bruised grass and muddy veins of Maple Hollow. The town had begun to remember what sunlight felt like. Weak, but willing. Evelyn Carter pinned a handmade sign to the church's wooden fence. Free first aid class. Healing Hands Project. The handwriting was neat, but not perfect. Each letter slightly tilted, as if straining forward toward belief. She stepped back to admire her work. Behind her, 3 children ran across the churchyard, laughing, their arms full of gauze rolls and old towels. The sight made her smile, wide, unguarded. Her dark brown eyes, usually tired from sleepless nights, gleamed with quiet purpose. Inside the fellowship hall, the sunlight filtered through old stained glass, scattering shards of color across the tables. Evelyn began setting up supplies, bandages, antiseptic bottles, clean cloths. Her reflection in the glass looked softer today, less haunted. For the first time in years, she felt useful again. Robert was outside near the truck, his hands busy repairing the strings of a battered guitar, its wood worn to the color of honey and smoke. He hummed tunelessly, a soldier's habit from lonely outposts. Every few seconds, his eyes drifted to Evelyn through the window. Seeing her smile made the noise in his head grow quieter. Micah, their son, was chasing Buddy across the square. The boy's laughter ricocheted against brick walls like the sound of spring itself. His hair, brown with sunlight streaks, danced wildly as Buddy, large, graceful, disciplined, pretended to lose the race on purpose. The German shepherd's black and tan coat shimmered under the morning light, tail wagging like a flag of peace. From the porch of the general store, Mr. Harlan Briggs, the storekeeper, watched them with mild amusement. Briggs was a man carved from practical worries, late 50s, tall, shoulders stooped from decades of lifting crates. His gray mustache drooped like a comma waiting for the next sentence. Once a volunteer firefighter, he now spent his days organizing shelves and eavesdropping on hope. He called out, "Your boy runs like he's racing the wind, Carter." Robert gave a half smile. He'll need that wind when it's time to climb mountains. Briggs nodded. Just don't let the world take the breath out of him first. That line hung in the air, heavy and true. By afternoon, Robert was at Elias Mason's barn, helping the old Marine rehang a crooked door. The two men worked in synchronized silence, the kind that exists between people who've both seen explosions up close. The barn smelled of hay and old oil. Then came the crunch of tires on gravel. A dusty red pickup truck pulled up near the fence. 3 men climbed out. Their laughter came first, too loud for an empty field. They were young, maybe late 20s, dressed in camouflage jackets that hadn't seen real service. The first, Caleb Rourke, was lean and jittery, with blonde stubble and a restless smirk that never quite reached his blue eyes. The second, Tanner Boyd, heavier and slower, had a red beard and a beer can permanently welded to his right hand. The third was younger, barely more than a boy, Jesse Holt, whose wide gray eyes darted like a rabbit's. They called themselves the Ridge Hunters, self-appointed patrolmen claiming to protect Maple Hollow from wolves and coyotes. But Robert saw it instantly. They were men who needed enemies to feel alive. Caleb pointed at Buddy. "That your mutt, old man? Looks like a washed-up service dog. What's he do, fetch your meds?" Robert straightened. His voice was calm, but it held the weight of command. "Don't touch him." Caleb grinned, baring teeth too white for sincerity. "Relax, soldier. We're just having fun." Robert's eyes hardened. "Fun's not the same thing as respect." For a long moment, the air froze. Then Caleb spat into the snow, muttered something to his friends, and turned away. But before he climbed into the truck, he gave Robert a look that wasn't done yet, a promise of trouble. Mason watched from the barn doorway. His voice was a low rasp. "You just met the town's reminder that ignorance breeds even in winter." Robert sighed, and like weeds, it grows faster when you ignore it. That evening, Evelyn's class was fuller than ever. Women from the diner, teenagers, even Mr. Briggs attended. The room buzzed with chatter and cautious laughter. Evelyn moved between tables, showing how to tie splints and check pulses. Micah sat in the corner drawing pictures of people with glowing hearts, his way of describing healing. Buddy lay near the door, alert but relaxed. Robert watched from the back of the room, hands in pockets, pride and worry mixing behind his calm face. But outside the church, shadows moved. Caleb and his friends were parked by the tree line, headlights off. Their whispers mixed with the clicking of lighter caps and the slosh of cheap whiskey. "Town's all sweet on the vet and his nurse," Tanner sneered. "Maybe they need reminding who's in charge." Caleb flicked his lighter again and again, eyes reflecting the small flame. Maybe they need a lesson, something that burns. That night, snow began to fall again, soft and deceptive. Robert couldn't sleep. He had the kind of instincts you don't unlearn, the kind that whispered when the world wasn't right. He took Buddy and walked the perimeter around the church and schoolyard. The moonlight turned the snow silver. That's when he saw movement near the woods. One figure, smaller, stumbling. He called out, "You lost?" The figure froze. It was Jesse, the youngest of the trio. His face was pale, lips cracked. He held his arms close to his chest like someone ashamed of what they carried. Robert approached slowly. "You're one of Rourke's men." "I was," Jesse stammered. "I didn't know I just wanted to see if the dog was real. Then things got bad. I haven't eaten in 2 days." Robert studied him. Thin frame, hollow cheeks, fear hiding behind exhaustion. "You look about 20, he said. "Too young to hate anyone." He reached into his coat, pulled out a wrapped sandwich and a bottle of water, tossed them over. "Eat." Jesse blinked, confused. "You ain't gonna call the sheriff?" Robert shook his head. "No. Tomorrow morning, you come to Mason's barn. You'll work. You'll eat again when the work's done." Buddy barked once, as if seconding the deal. The boy's eyes glistened. "Why help me?" Robert's gaze turned distant. "Because somebody once did the same for me, before I was worth helping." When Robert returned home, Evelyn was awake, sitting by the fire with a blanket around her shoulders. She didn't need to ask. "Another stray?" He smiled faintly. "Maybe the right one." The next morning dawned with promise. Children's laughter echoed down Main Street. Evelyn prepared to open her class early. The first aid banner fluttered like a white flag of peace. But before noon, a scream tore through the calm. Smoke was rising from the churchyard. Robert dropped his tools and ran. Mason shouted something behind him, but the wind devoured the words. The storage barn behind the church, the one Evelyn used to keep medical supplies, was on fire. Flames leapt through the shingles, orange and alive. Inside, Evelyn's students were trapped. The doors had been chained from the outside. Robert's heart slammed once and broke into motion. "Buddy, find them!" The dog charged through smoke before anyone could stop him. The crowd screamed as glass shattered from heat. Robert grabbed an iron bar and smashed the padlock. The door swung open with a rush of smoke and terrified cries. Inside, Evelyn was on her knees, her face streaked with soot, voice hoarse from shouting instructions. "Get low! Cover your mouths!" Buddy barked from across the room, teeth gripping the heavy curtain, tugging it down to clear a path. Robert pushed through smoke, grabbed Evelyn around the shoulders. "Move!" One by one, they pulled the children out. Asher first, coughing. Doris next, clutching her cross pendant. Then Milo, dragging a first aid kit like a trophy. Finally, Evelyn stumbled out, half carried by Robert. Buddy close behind, his fur singed, but his eyes fierce. The fire engine arrived too late to save the barn, but not too late to see courage. Pastor Glenn, tears shining on his weathered face, whispered a prayer over the noise. The townspeople, once hesitant, surrounded the Carters with blankets, gratitude, and something else, a rekindled faith. When Caleb Rourke and Tanner Boyd were finally caught near the river with gas cans in their truck, Jesse wasn't with them. He had spent the morning at Mason's barn, stacking wood like a man, earning redemption one plank at a time. That night, Evelyn sat on the steps of the church, her face lit by the pale light of 1,000 stars. Her hands trembled only slightly as she poured water for Buddy, who drank slowly, ears still twitching for danger. Robert sat beside her, arm around her shoulders. "You did good today," he said quietly. "So did you," she whispered back. "But it scares me. How close we were to losing everything again." He nodded. "Fear's a teacher, not a jailer." Micah came out carrying a blanket, yawning. "Mom, are we going to stay here forever?" Robert smiled. "For now, until Maple Hollow can stand on its own feet." He looked toward the distance, where the smoldering remains of the barn sent up one last column of smoke, thin as a question mark. The next morning, the sheriff brought Robert the fire report. Something about the evidence didn't sit right. Among the ashes, they had found a cut beam, not burned, but severed cleanly with a saw. Robert's jaw tightened. He looked at Evelyn. "It wasn't just those boys," he said. "Someone else wanted this town to burn." She met his eyes. "Then we'll find out who. Together." Outside, Buddy barked once, facing the mountains. The wind carried his voice across Maple Hollow, a warning, a promise, and a beginning. A week later, the snow returned the way an old hymn returns, familiar, forgiving, and full of notes you only hear when you close your eyes. Maple Hollow wore winter like a borrowed coat, a little big at the shoulders, but warm enough if you kept moving. The new storage shed behind St. Bartholomew's, rebuilt with hands that smelled of pine and contrition, stood straight as a promise. Evelyn's class had doubled, then doubled again, as if knowledge were a lantern that made more light every time another person lit their wick from it. On the square, Robert Carter, Elias Lee Mason, and a half-dozen of the town's young men set posts into frost-bitten earth and laid deck boards across sawhorses. Their breath rose like smoke signals. Hammers spoke in steady syllables. Even the wind paused to listen. Micah supervised as only 8-year-olds can, wearing a wool hat with a ridiculous pom-pom, a pencil behind his ear like a foreman. Buddy, the 4-year-old German shepherd, patrolled the site with a sergeant's eye for corners and a poet's tenderness for anyone small. He leaned against the shins of the nervous and nudged gloved hands when they forgot to pet him, which, here, was almost never. Evelyn strung lengths of warm gold lights between lampposts, measuring with her arms because tape measures lacked poetry. Her cheeks shone, hair tucked beneath a navy wool cap. Her dark eyes had that good shine. Sleep-starved and hopeful. On a plywood sign she painted, with Mr. Harlan Briggs' careful lettering help, Winter Harmony, a night to remember. The paint bled a little where the brush got ambitious. Evelyn left the imperfection in on purpose. Beauty, she'd learned, was sometimes the part that wouldn't obey. Robert tuned the old guitar he'd rescued from a pawn shop in Idaho years ago. The wood had mellowed to the color of whiskey at dusk. His hands were clever and scarred, the kind that could steady a ladder, restart a heart, or coax music out of a thing that had survived neglect. Every few moments he glanced toward the church steps, where Evelyn checked lists and counted blankets, and laid out thermoses of cocoa like rations for a better war. Pastor Glenn Whitaker appeared with a basket of knitted scarves made by a league of elders who refused to be retired from kindness. He looked smaller in his heavy coat, narrow shoulders, bulked by wool, gray beard trimmed like someone who respected the mirror even when the mirror told hard truths. "For the children," he said, laying the scarves out where small hands could find them. "And for those who have forgotten, they are someone's child, once upon a time." Berta Klein from the motor court arrived with a tray of cinnamon twists and a scolding for the cold that would have embarrassed a January wind. Doris Talley, the round-cheeked grandmother whose laughter deserved its own pew, brought a folding chair that squeaked with the insistence of old joints. Teenagers Asher Pike and Milo, Vance practiced coiling extension cords like sailors, comparing knots and not noticing they were becoming reliable. Jesse Holt, the youngest of the Three Ridge hunters who'd spiraled nearly into arson, spent his morning hefting lumber like a penance. A boyish man in an outgrown coat, he had that hollowed look of someone walking away from a cliff without looking back, because looking back might cost balance. He kept to himself, but every time Robert said thank you, something in Jesse's posture found a less fearful height. From the edge of the square, Sheriff Lila Moreno watched the bustle with the wary affection of a shepherd who'd counted her flock too many nights to trust a calm. She was in her 40s, compact, with brown skin warmed by the cold into a kind of copper. Her black hair, raked back into a tight bun, glistened with snow dust. Lila's jaw had clean lines, the kind war stories give to people who never had to leave home to learn duty. Her war had been the attrition of years. Meth houses shuttered, bad marriages negotiated, teenagers diverted back into possibility. The county budget fitted her like a too small coat. She wore it anyway. A silver star glinted at her breast. Her eyes, dark and untired, missed very little. She walked over, boots making law on the slush. "The platform looks good," she said to Robert. "If it collapses, I reserve the right to say I warned you while helping you lift it back up." "It'll hold," Robert said, smiling from the side of his mouth. "We overbuilt the joists. Carpenter's secret. When in doubt, add a joist and a prayer." Lila considered him the way competent people evaluate other competent people, weighing tool belt and tone, steadiness and humor. "You'll play tonight?" she asked, nodding at the guitar. "If my hands remember," he said. "They will," Evelyn said, from a step above, descending with a box of paper cups like an angel who understood logistics. She offered Lila cocoa. The sheriff wrapped her hands around it like a truce. Across the square, Sarah Lynn stepped from the bus with a violin case and a smile that disarmed weather. She was 30, tall and slim, with a dancer's posture. Her hair was black, cut in a sleek bob that framed a face alive to the world, eyes dark as ink, and just as capable of writing new stories. She had once taught music in a district 2 counties over until funding vanished like a magician's coin. Since then, she'd pieced together lessons in church basements and tuned pianos that should have been pensions. Sarah moved through the town with the calm of a woman who had learned the hardest instrument is the human heart. "Ms. Lynn," Pastor Glenn called, hurrying as much as knees allowed. "You came." "Your message said, 'Bring strings and hope,'" Sarah said, patting the violin case. "I've got both." She set her case on a bench and greeted Buddy as if he were a baritone in her ensemble. Buddy nosed her, hand, then looked up at Robert as if to say she'll do. By late afternoon, snow began to thicken. Bigger flakes now, confident, descending with the authority of an encore. The square transformed. Light strands lit like captured constellations. Paper lanterns swung outside the diner. The stage stood, modest but sturdy. Dressed in sage green fabric, someone had scavenged from a bridal shop's attic. On the church door, a felt banner read, "Open Hearts." Open hands in letters children had glued on crookedly, which made the words more urgent. The power company had sent a lanky lineman in a battered parka, Owen Wires Kincaid, late 30s, beard like a winter thicket, hands nicked by a decade of climbing creosote poles. Owen moved quiet, from junction box to breaker, like a man speaking to a shy horse. He checked the generator Pastor Glenn had borrowed from the volunteer firehouse and nodded. "Should run the stage and a handful of shop lights," he said. "Don't ask it to do miracles, but hymns? It'll do hymns." Evening descended in blue layers. People came, hesitant at first, then in clusters, then in a steady stream that warmed the square by sheer human math. Children thumped in boots, small mouths decorated with cocoa mustaches. The elders came in the pride of well-worn coats. Men who'd been strangers met near the cord spool and discovered they both loved the same bad baseball team. Women who'd waved from a distance now clasped each other's hands. Maple Hollow, which had forgotten how to stand in the same place without bracing, stood together. Robert stepped up when the pastor nodded, guitar strap snug across his chest. His breath made small ghosts in the air. From the front row, Micah flashed a thumbs up so fierce it nearly toppled him. Evelyn stood at the edge of the stage, fingers laced, lips parted in a smile that steadied him more than any three-point stance learned in training. He plucked a testing note. It trembled, then held. He looked at them, these faces behind window glass all week, now here under string lights and snowfall. He looked at Mason, chin lifted, at Jesse near the back, hands jammed into pockets like a boy catching courage. He looked at Sheriff Lila, arms folded, stance balanced, as if she could absorb trouble by posture alone. He looked at Sarah Lynn, who tipped her chin like a conductor. He looked at Evelyn and found the only cue that mattered. "This song," he said, voice low and rough as gravel under tires, "is for the ones who didn't make it home, and for those who came back with parts missing you can't always see." He glanced at Mason, who tipped 2 fingers off his brow, as if to say, he began with a steady, simple progression, the kind that felt like a road you'd driven in both joy and weather. His voice wasn't pretty. It was true. On the second verse, Sarah lifted the violin and traced a line of melody that found the spaces and filled them with mercy. A child started, clapping late and out of rhythm. Doris laughed and made wrong time sound like right joy. Buddy, lying at Micah's boots, lifted his head, ears forward, eyes soft. He exhaled the long sigh of a creature who knows he's where he is meant to be. By the chorus, voices joined, first the brave, then the sure, then the ones who thought they'd forgotten how. Evelyn's harmony threaded through Robert's melody like mountain water through stone, clean, certain. A snowflake landed on her upper lip. She let it melt into the song. The square glowed as light soaked the snow, and the snow agreed to be lit. They sang about home, and about walking when tired, and about the small ordinary graces, hot bread, a hand at your elbow, a dog sleeping through the worst part of the night because it trusts you to keep the rest. They sang like people who knew grief and refused to let grief have the last line. On the third chorus, the flakes grew fat and fast, dancing in light, catching on eyelashes and in beards, and on guitar strings that still rang. Micah pressed into his parents. Buddy stood and leaned into Micah. And for a heart-still moment, Maple Hollow was less a town and more a choir. Inside a snow globe that had been shaken by a benevolent giant. Then, mid-applause, the world snapped to black. The square gasped. The humming generator choked off as if an invisible hand had strangled it. A breathless dark took the lights, the stage, the church windows, the shop signs, everything but the weak, stubborn glow of oil lamps someone had thought to light at the perimeter. The dark had a sound. Children swallowing cries, a man cursing softly and ashamed, the wind using the sudden quiet to get louder. From the north edge of town came another sound, the throaty growl of engines creeping low in gear. Headlights swung across the snow, harsh and impatient, and fixed on the stage like interrogators' lamps. Robert handed his guitar to Sarah, who set it down flat, mother quick. "Evelyn, inside," he said quietly. He pointed with 2 fingers toward the church. "You and Micah. Now." Evelyn nodded once, and because her face understood urgency but refused to understand fear, Micah obeyed without argument. Buddy stood, fur rising along his spine, a sound half growl, half prayer collecting in his chest. 3 trucks idled just beyond the square, exhaust pluming into the cold. In the lead pickup, Caleb Rourke leaned out the window. smile wrong as a cut in a load-bearing beam. Tanner Boyd hunched beside him, red beard sticky with bravado, bottle tilted between knees. In the second truck sat two men Robert did not recognize. Farm strong, eyes borrowed from winter. Jed Malik and Royce Pettigrew, both locals who wore meanness like a jacket they'd convinced themselves was weather. The third truck held a driver whose face Robert could not see. He saw instead a silhouette in the passenger seat, a hat brim, a cigarette ember. The ember bobbed like an impatient clock, Sheriff. Lila took one step forward and two sideways, as if drawing a line and spreading weight across ice. Her hand hovered above her holster, but stayed there. A reminder that the best weapon is often restraint. "Evening, Caleb," she called, voice carrying like a clear bell. "Nice night to mind your own roads." Caleb laughed, that thin sound with edges. "Just out for a drive, Sheriff. Heard the town was singing nonsense again. Figured we'd bring feedback." Robert stepped down from the stage to the snow so that light pinned him, and not his people. "You're trespassing on our peace," he said. Caleb snorted. "Your peace? You roll in here with your charity and your dog and your wife's little classes and think people forget what it's like to be left? The power goes out, and look, no saviors, just candles and noise. Power goes out because men with cutters cut lines," Owen Kincaid muttered near the breaker panel, kneeling over the quiet generator. Fingers already checking the fuel line, a quick slice he hadn't put there. He held up the rubber hose for Lila to see. Clean Seaver. She saw. Her jaw balled like a fist. She looked to the truck with the hat brim and the ember. The ember paused, then glowed deeper. Pastor Glenn moved to Robert's side, small and stubborn in his peacoat. Mason limped up, propping on his cane, the wood thudding a declaration. Harlan Briggs came with a shovel in his hand, the kind of tool men choose when they refuse to pick up the wrong kind of instrument. Sarah lifted the violin to her shoulder and raised the bow, not high, just ready. From the second truck, Jed Malik hopped out, boots crunching aggression into the snow. "This town used to mind its own," he said. "Now it's got sing-alongs and bandages and folks thinking they deserve something." He spat sideways. "I say it needs reminding who keeps it real." "Who?" Doris Talley called from the crowd, voice carrying mischief and steel. "Men who can't fix their own engines without breaking other people's lights?" The square rippled with nervous laughter. Humor, wielded right, is a shield. Caleb revved the engine, tires twitching. "What are you gonna do, soldier? Play me a lullaby?" Robert took one slow step forward. Snow refroze, whispering beneath his boot. Buddy moved with him, head level, tail still. Eyes locked on the driver's door handle like a called shot. "I'm going to do what I do," Robert said. "Protect the ones who sing so loud their throats hurt tomorrow. And if you need that to sound like a threat, that's your ear's choice, not my mouth's." For a beat too long, the night forgot how to breathe. Then, of all miracles or strategic masterstrokes, Sarah Lynn began to play. She didn't ask, or apologize, or wait. She drew the bow across the strings, soft at first, a melody that sounded like remembering the name of a friend you thought you'd lost. The notes slipped into the dark like hand warmers. They went around Lila's poised stance and under Mason's burdened breath. They went into the crowd, where children pressed from doorways and women gripped one another's sleeves. They went even to the trucks, where men with bad nights in them felt something shift that wasn't the gear. A second violin line entered, thin and brave. Asher Pike, cheeks flaming, held a borrowed student fiddle like a life preserver, and did what his body had wanted all week, to be useful in a way that made noise into balm. Milo clapped into the rests, wrong and right at once. Evelyn's voice, clear, bright, rose, unaccompanied at first, then found Robert's low harmony like a river meeting its shadow. The song wasn't a hymn or a country standard. It was a line they invented together in the square. We are here, and we are more than what hurt us. Under the music, Lila Moreno stepped forward another foot. Boys, she said, not loud, but true. I've got a jail with new blankets and old regrets. I've got a DA who's tired of my calls. I've also got a town behind me, and a deputy 2 blocks down with a camera rolling on a tripod. If you're about to make a bad choice, at least let it be one you're proud to watch later. The cigarette ember in the third truck went still. The hat brim lifted enough to reveal a face like polished pine. Eldon Price, mid-50s, a developer's jaw and a banker's suit under a rancher's coat. He'd once grown the county fair with sponsorships and shrunk the housing stock with loopholes. His eyes were pale, uncommitted. He exhaled smoke through his nose like a dragon on a diet. Robert's fingers found the red plastic fuel cap in his pocket by memory. Eldon's gaze flicked, a glance quick as a blade, toward the generator and back. Robert filed the movement away where veterans keep folders labeled later. Caleb's grin faltered under a chorus. He looked left to Tanner, who licked his lips and found only wind on them. Right to Jed, who shifted and suddenly cared how many porch lights had flicked on across the square. In the back of the first truck, Jesse Holt, whom Caleb had not realized was standing with the townsfolk, stepped forward into the headlight wash. Caleb! Jesse's voice cracked but carried. Leave it. You're with them now? Caleb sneered. Traitor. I was with no one for a long time, Jesse said, pulling his shoulders up to a shape his courage could fit. I'm changing that. Tanner snorted. He'll run. He always runs. I'm tired, Jesse said simply. And that word, said like that, slotted into something human in the square. Several heads nodded. Exhaustion, it turns out, is a kind of truth serum. Buddy gave one sharp bark, not a threat, but a metronome. He regarded Caleb as if the man had a splinter in his soul the dog would remove if allowed close enough. The absurdity of the thought almost made Robert laugh. Almost. Eldon Price lowered his window to let cold slap his face awake. His voice came out smooth, the way river stones are smooth from repeated excuses. Gentlemen, he drawled, seems to me you've made your point. Let these citizens have their music. I'm sure they'll be less interested in concerts when they learn what their property taxes will look like next quarter. He flicked ash, rolled the window up, and tapped the dash. The third truck eased back. Caleb bristled, but his bravado did not have independent power like a generator. It needed fuel and a crowd. The crowd wasn't on his side. He revved the engine once, because small kings must have gestures, then threw the truck into reverse. Tanner stared too long at Buddy, and then looked away first. Jed and Royce followed like shadows, reconsidering their owners. The trucks rolled back up Maple Street, taillights small and cowardly. The square stood still, then exhaled as if from deep water. Owen Kincaid grunted from the Jenny. Line's cut. Easy fix. He slid a fresh piece of hose from his tool bag, clamped it, and turned the choke like a magician choosing his one good trick. The generator coughed, thought about its life choices, and then caught. Lights flickered to their warm constellation patter, shy at first, then brightening. The square erupted, not the wild cheer of victory, but the warm, relieved sound of a community teaching itself how to clap for itself. Pastor Glenn dabbed his eyes in a way he would deny later. Doris hugged Milo and Asher with the ferocity of a woman who had decided there were no more rules about hugging. Sarah lowered her bow and pressed her cheek briefly to the violin's curve, like you do to any instrument that just remembered it was a body. Evelyn found Robert and wrapped both arms around him so tight he could feel the steady of her ribs. "You didn't flinch," she whispered. "I wanted to," he admitted. "But there were too many people watching who think courage is magic. It isn't. It's just decisions made in the right order." Buddy pressed sideways into both of them until they staggered and laughed, their breath joining above them in a small, vanishing cloud. They sang again, not because they weren't shaken, but because they were. And music is the best thing to do with shaking. The second set turned into a town hall with a backbeat. Sheriff Lila spoke from the stage about reports and repairs. Harlan promised free coffee to anyone who brought photographs to be scanned for insurance records. Owen instructed them how to check the breaker panel if the lights played tricks again. Sarah led a round with the children, because children should always be convinced they can lead adults somewhere kinder. Near the edge of the square, Eldon Price's black SUV paused just long enough for Robert to see the profile of a man memorizing a weakness. Eldon lifted 2 fingers off the wheel, a gesture that looked like a wave from a governor and felt like a tally mark on a Tioqua private list. Then he rolled away into the dark, where men like him did their best work. The concert wound down near midnight. The last cups of cocoa went lukewarm. The lanterns fluttered like tired birds. People left in pairs and clumps, their boots telling the square important gossip about weight and direction. Buddy escorted a pair of toddlers to their mother as if toddler herding were a specialized K-9 discipline. Mason, who'd stood too long on his good leg, sagged hard into his cane and pretended he hadn't. Robert pretended not to notice while offering an elbow, which is how you love a proud man without making pride the enemy. Back at the motor court, the Carters lit their little room the old-fashioned way, lamp, match, breath held, while the flame decided whether to live. Micah fell asleep before his hat did. Buddy claimed the foot of the bed like he was pinning down a map. Evelyn tucked a blanket around her son, then sat beside Robert on the small couch. The couch springs had opinions. They made them known. "That man in the 3rd truck," she said. "Who was he?" "Eldon Price," Robert said, tasting the name. "Developer, donor, a man with friends who prefer municipal dinners to municipal responsibilities. I saw his eyes at the generator before the lights died." Owen found a cut line. "You think he's behind the beam at Mason's? And the fire?" Her voice didn't tremble. It sharpened. "I think some people prefer a town broken," Robert said. "Broken towns are cheap to buy." Evelyn laid her head on his shoulder. "Then we mend faster than they can break." He smiled into her hair. "That's our specialty." They sat in silence, the lights humming, the snow finding a place to fall. Robert reached up and scratched Buddy's ear, making the big dog pant softly in gratitude. He thought of Caleb's eyes, Jesse's trembling stance, Lila's steady walk, Sarah's bow, Owen's calm mumble, Eldon's "mark me" wave. He thought of how easily fear could creep in and how stubbornly hope had to be trained. Robert thought of leaving town. "We'll go again tomorrow," he said. "Where?" Evelyn asked. "To where there's light. There's more heart to mend." Out the window, Buddy lay with his head on his legs, eyes half closed. Snow was falling again, but this time, white as the beginning of a new faith. The lights flickered once, then quieted. Outside, the snow kept its silent promises. Inside, the family breathed like a creature made to withstand the elements. Maple Hollow, the town that no longer believed its own reflection, stood in the square and found itself singing. It wasn't a cure, but it was medicine. And medicine, applied consistently, can change the prognosis. As dawn painted the sky with silver light, the Carters stood once more at the edge of town. Behind them, Maple Hollow shimmered beneath a quiet snowfall. No longer a place of silence, but of songs, laughter, and second chances. Robert turned to look one last time at the square where the townspeople had sung together beneath the falling snow. Evelyn slipped her hand into his. Micah's small fingers curled inside hers. Buddy trotted beside them, his fur glinting gold where the sunlight touched. A faithful shadow against a world finally learning to heal. They had mended roofs and hearts, but the road ahead still called. Because healing isn't a destination, it's a journey. And sometimes, God Himself walks the road unseen, planting little miracles in the footprints we leave behind. Somewhere between the wind and the silence, Robert whispered a prayer. May this light we've kindled never fade. And maybe, just maybe, heaven whispered back, keep walking. I'll meet you in the next town. So they left Maple Hollow with smiles, with love, and with the quiet certainty that grace still lives in ordinary days. May the Lord bless all who watch and share these stories. May He heal what is broken, renew what is weary, and let His miracles find you where you stand. If this story touched your heart, please share it. Leave a comment about what moved you most, and subscribe to follow the Carter family's continuing journey, because their story is not over. The road still stretches ahead, the music still plays, and the miracles of God, they're waiting in the next chapter.